Hello, welcome to this conversation, this Qredible Live Broadcast. My name is Taylor. I'm with marketing at Qredible. We're going to talk today about challenges and changes in the cannabis beverage industry. Here with Brian Fitzpatrick, CEO of Qredible, and Paulo Sobral, the general manager for Area 1075, owned by the same family as Sierra Nevada Brewing and sitting adjacent to the brewery. Area 1075 produces cannabis and functional beverages for high-performing brands. He is on a mission to destigmatize cannabis and improve worldwide human access via cannabis-infused beverages. Thank you both for being here with us today.
Absolutely. Great to be here and great to talk about this topic.
Yes. So Paulo, I was hoping you can start us off by telling us a bit about your background and your current gig.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been in the cannabis industry here in California since March of 2016. So that predated adult recreational use in the state. And I joined because before I joined, I was at PepsiCo for nearly 6 years. And I was looking to both transition away from a corporate environment and build something myself, and to also sell something I can be a little bit more passionate about. Because while I was passionate about the marketing behind our products at Pepsi, they weren't anything that I created myself, and they honestly weren't things I personally consumed. So I got into cannabis personally a couple years prior to that. Heard some stories about the therapeutic benefits of CBD and how it cured epilepsy in children. I didn't have any children or didn't have any issues with epilepsy, but just started doing research and became comfortable with the plant myself. And I didn't know exactly what my role was going to be in the industry, but I knew I was going to be big, and I just wanted to get in and start to learn it. But really, where I settled into was cannabis beverages. In 2019, I was recruited by a leading company that emulsifies extracts to be dispersed into beverages. And I thought, with my background in beverage CPG and my background in cannabis, that we would kind of lead the forefront in creating cannabis infused beverages. And that company did. But there was a lot of other challenges beyond just putting cannabis extracts into liquid in this category that's kind of hindering its potential of being the largest category in cannabis. So I shifted away from that and did some consulting. Most recently was the general manager for a brand called Can, which is the largest THC infused beverage in the world right now. And as of recently, I joined Area 1075 as the general manager.
That is wonderful. And, you talk about the challenges and, you've sort of been there and done that, and you're continuing to evolve in the space. And so, we really, this industry is so nascent that you're really a pioneer. And you're certainly a passionate advocate and educator. I've noticed that it's very important. You always stress education in this space, and I think the great thing, Paolo, is you're willing to share your experiences from the good, the bad, and the ugly, to ensure that this industry advances safely and legitimately. So, kudos to you for all the work you're doing. And but it really begs the questions. You mentioned that word challenge a couple times. What do you see as some of the big issues for the cannabis beverage industry and some of the challenges?
Yeah, so my premise of why I'm so passionate. Well, first, thank you. And my premise is that cannabis beverages are going to be the largest category in cannabis, and that premise is pretty simple. Everybody drinks liquid multiple times a day, and the only thing that's keeping them from drinking a cannabis infused liquid is either stigmas, or they're just not comfortable putting it into their body. For the people that are comfortable putting it into their body, what's keeping them from getting the product right now is access. So they can't buy these drinks where they buy their other drinks, bars, restaurants, grocery stores, you name it. So that's the biggest challenge, is getting distribution uh, from people who are already distributing and selling beverages. Obviously, regulations need to change to get there. They are changing in some states right now. Minnesota is the best example I can speak of, where major retailers like Total Wine are carrying the drinks. But beyond that, what I focused on is manufacturing. So Sierra Nevada Brewing obviously is a high quality producer of beverages. So I had a company here who has experience building out an operation like that. So we are going to solve that challenge from a high quality manufacturing standpoint, because prior to that, we had a lot of scrappy startups and made some cannabis manufacturers that ventured into beverages that were supplying the category. And the challenge in both is when you are a startup or you're diversifying and you're in cannabis, is they don't have the proper resources to invest in beverage equipment that can operate at scale. So that means the products are sterilized in ways that maybe the brands wouldn't prefer. So they have to put chemicals in there versus pasteurizing the product. The lines aren't as efficient, both from cleaning and filling. So that nets a higher unit cost that the brand has to then pass on to the consumer. And if the consumer is making a beverage decision, and cannabis beverages are positioned next to alcohol or kombuchas, and they're dramatically higher in retail price, then that is also hindering the growth in the category. So really, the challenges are we just can't sell and make these drinks like we can make other drinks. They're still being regulated as cannabis products. And there's some nuance involved there, obviously, because these are cannabinoids and we're still learning a lot about them.
Mhm.
But there's going to be a day where we are going to be able to produce and sell them just like we can alcohol and other beverages. And that's when I really think the category is going to take off.
Well, you're really talking a lot about the supply chain and the supply side and the manufacturing side. And we're going to get a little bit more deeper into that with some of those issues and challenges. But you wrote in an article last month that in the realm of cannabis beverages, the landscape is teeming with potential yet to be fully realized. And that's a quote directly from one of your articles. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the demand side of this and the sort of the emerging market for cannabis beverages, because it seems like customers want to cut back on the booze, like the younger people in particular, but they don't want to cut back on the buzz, so they're looking for, sort of, how can they use a cannabis drink. And what it seems to be is it's not the traditional cannabis user that's the market. They're still focused on smoking and vape, but the I always call it the shadow consumer, because there's lots of people that are watching it and they're getting involved as legalization comes forward, and the stigma is becoming less. That seems to be the market, that it would be this new sort of cannabis consumer as opposed to those traditional ones. And the market seems to be, I mean, seriously poised for growth from a demand side. I mean, I think in 2022, I think the numbers were somewhere around 400 million as far as a total addressable market, and you can see those numbers all over the place depending on who does the surveys. But they're proposing all the way up to 2032, like almost a 40% compound annual growth rate in this market. I mean, that's huge growth potential on the demand side. What would your comments be sort of on that demand side that you see?
Well, I think demand is tremendous and it's hard to quantify because we're still in the early stages of it. I like to use examples from other sectors. Like if you looked at demand for computers in the 70s, nobody would have forecasted that one day everyone would have one in their pocket and are using it to send pictures to their grandmother.
So true.
So I think if stigmas and regulations were equal, cannabis beverages would outsell alcohol. And I know that's a pretty bold statement and a lot of work needs to be done to get there. But to get back to what the market is today and what's the short-term potential for the market, I think there's three categories of consumers that you should look at if you're going to develop your own brand and product. One of them is really developed, and that's the consumer who is, I call it looking for liquid edible, basically. So this is the high dose consumer. They're very comfortable and very familiar with cannabis. They smoke cannabis, they dab cannabis. And to them, a beverage is just a different way to consume cannabis. Either they're in a place where it's not socially acceptable to blow smoke, like a restaurant, perfect
Mhm.
example,
Mhm.
or they want something that's, an edible high is different than a smoking high. So they want that edible high, but they want it to kick in quicker. So they'll take a drink instead of eat a bunch of gummies. That market, I think, is very developed. We know who that person is, and there's already some leaders in that space. But I think that market is, uh, I don't want to say tapped out, but it's being served. I'll just put it that way.
Mhm.
The market that's getting the most attention right now in the short term is the alcohol alternative market, and that's what you were talking about, and that's really where Can focused. This is a consumer who may or may not be comfortable and familiar with cannabis, but they are used to drinking alcohol, and they're
Right.
looking to cut back on the alcohol consumption not for moral reasons, but just trying to reduce the calories and the hangovers that come with alcohol. So
Yeah,
that
and
market, I think, is the biggest short-term addressable market.
that's interesting because Gallup did a survey that they reported that every year since 1992, beer has been the most popular alcoholic beverage, and the percentage of beer drinkers is often double that of liquor drinkers. So cannabis drinks, seem to be heading in the direction that cannabis drinks are to cannabis products like beer is to alcohol, right? And if you draw that sort of analogy, it seems like it could definitely be heading in that direction. And so, just as with beer, its lower alcohol content appeals to, or no alcohol content appeals to people as the lower THC content would be to these cannabis consumers. So it's going to be interesting to watch to see what happens.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I have a lot of conversations with cannabis enthusiasts who say these products are inferior to their favorite way of consuming cannabis. And I always argue it's not replacing your favorite way to consume. You're going to keep consuming your favorite way. Let's say it is a dab. If you're going to dab, you're going to probably get cottonmouth and you're going to consume liquid. So instead of consuming a liquid with 0 milligrams of cannabinoids, why wouldn't you drink the same liquid, but if it also had 5 milligrams of cannabinoids instead? And the answer is usually it's too expensive. So if we get the cost down, then everyone is an addressable customer for cannabis drinks, assuming they're comfortable with ingesting cannabis to begin with.
Well, let's talk about the cost because you worked at Pepsi and you know how the distribution works, the manufacture and the distribution. So they can manufacture in central locations and distribute out to multiple locations. You can't really do that with cannabis beverage, right? Because you've got state prohibitions, you've got limited retail outlets, you've got all those challenges. So manufacturing presents sort of a significant challenge to a cannabis beverage maker because cannabis can't cross state lines. So each beverage has to be brewed and bottled in a home state, which it makes it almost impossible to achieve those economies of scale and cost savings that alcoholic drink companies can achieve, and even soda and companies like Pepsi. So, what are your thoughts about that and how that can be managed?
Uh, well, it's not. It's going to be very difficult to manage until you can cross state lines with the product. So leaders in cannabis beverages, who I worked for, Keef Cola, who's been around since 2010. Both of them are in over 10 markets, and even more if you count hemp derived, which is another can of worms. So the operations teams at those companies have to manage 10 different contract manufacturers in each state. On top of that, some states have different requirements for what's allowed in the formulation. So you might have a different formulation in each state or different states, and the packaging is all different in each individual state. So when I worked at Pepsi in California past Prop 65, that was a little bit of a pain point for Pepsi because now you had to put this warning that was only required in the state of California. So that hindered the companies as big as Pepsi's economies of scale on packaging and efficiencies. And these brands are all subscale, especially relative to somebody like Pepsi. And compound that with the challenge of a lot of these manufacturers never made a beverage until a couple years ago, or maybe their focus is pre-rolls and vapes. That means the brands have to go in there and hold their hands a lot more than they're used to.
Right.
So I can't solve the problem on a national scale unless the legislation changes. But for California, at least, for brands, part of my promise to them is you won't have to worry about your operations in California if you work with us. We'll produce the drinks at a higher quality standard than even the state asked for, because Sierra Nevada was built producing high quality beverages, even to the detriment of things like sales and marketing. But outside of that, once you get to outside of California, people are a little bit on their own. And that's why I think until the legislation changes, instead of taking this approach that brands have taken, where they're just trying to expand anywhere they can and hope the federal legalization is going to come so that they can actually hit scale, it might be a little bit more prudent to just go deep and wide in markets where you can draw more revenue instead of being in multiple different states and juggling all those different operational inefficiencies.
So finding those states where it's there's less issues, if you will, to be able to do it, but you still have to find contract manufacturers. You still have to find suppliers in that area. And one of the things I've noticed about a lot of your talks and a lot of your writing, not only are you stressing education, but it's almost like compliance, 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 compliance. You know, you are well rooted coming from the beverage industry of, you know, the quality standards that have to be in place. So I want to sort of shift a little bit and talk about, you know, what do you believe is truly necessary to properly vet out the supply chain? Because it seems to be like if somebody makes a mistake in the supply chain, they want to pass it off, like, and it's not really their issue, but it becomes your issue, right? All of
Yeah.
a sudden, you are the one that's your name's on the brand. So, what are some of your recommendations for to basically help with this quality manufacturing and compliance?
Yeah, well, the advantage we have now that we didn't have when I started focusing on the category 4 years ago is there are suppliers with experience and they've done this before.
Mhm.
So to me, that's the most important piece of it is their experience. Obviously, the non-starters are, do they have the proper certifications? Do they have certificates of analysis? But if they have experience, just some examples in my early days into this category is somebody's making a canned beverage, and in California, you have to test within 10% of the potency that's advertised on the label. And sometimes there's challenges where that doesn't happen as you expected. And so then the batch comes back and the testing is off, where you have to make some decisions there. But before you make the decisions on what to do with the batch, you want to find out what the root cause of the problem is. So there's three parties that play a key role in that. With most beverages, that is, there's the emulsion supplier who supplies you the cannabinoid extract,
Mhm.
and then there's the contract manufacturer who takes all the ingredients and cans it, and then there's the testing lab. And unfortunately, I've been in situations where all three parties are pointing the finger at each other. When you want, if you're a responsible supplier and you're built for the long haul, you want to know if it's your issue so that you can correct the issue and make sure it doesn't happen going forward. So that's why it's important to work with people that are experienced. And I always recommend you start with the first step in the supply chain. So in this situation, it'd be the emulsion supplier because you need them before you put it in the can. So then the emulsion supplier should recommend a contract manufacturer, and the emulsion supplier and the contract manufacturer should recommend a testing lab. That way, they're all comfortable working together. They maybe had this challenge before, so there's less likelihood of it occurring again. And if there is something that pops up because your base formulation is unique, or maybe your sterilization method is unique, then they'll work together to find out what the problem is and come up with a solution.
Well, I mean, that's great advice. So, one of the things that Credible has really been focusing on is vetting and verifying the supply chain. And as we go deeper and deeper into, you know, each type of product that's being out there, you know, we create this validation process to validate and verify the supply chain. So one of the things we've noticed is improper badging. You know, companies will say that they're ISO certified. They'll say that they're GMP certified, and they're not, right? So it seems like marketing grabs these badges, throws them up on the website, and is really steering people the wrong way, because to be GMP, you know, certified and follow those safety standards are very important. To be ISO certified, you know, it takes time and money and effort and commitment to get there. So, you know, what we're doing is validating licensing and certifications, and also providing all of the due diligence for somebody who wants to manufacture can come in there and see that. And I think that's important technology, because that supply chain vetting doesn't really exist well in this industry. But going the point beyond that, and I'm sort of shifting to technology a little bit, you know, the tools for track and trace in this industry are not sufficient enough for food manufacturing, and true, even any cannabis product manufacturing, because they're only really focusing on THC and strain. But when you look at a true track and trace, you have to be able to, in food production or beverage manufacturing, you have to be able to trace all the way back, not just THC. So, talk to me a little bit how you see those track and trace in this industry having to sort of mature, and what your thoughts are about that.
That's a good point. and I'm going to run into this challenge pretty quickly. So where I'm at with our facility is we are interviewing for a head of operations right now, and this person is going to be crucial in what kind of software we implement into our processes. So a concern I've heard from other manufacturers is a lot of the typical ERP solutions that you would use in typical food and beverage production. Because again, in my mind and from a production standpoint, these are beverages with that forbidden ingredient added to it.
Right.
So the processes and technology and software used for beverages are probably what's most applicable. But then does it integrate with metric? I don't think most of the leading solutions do, or at least who the brewery uses as an example. So I might come up to that pain point pretty quickly here. But it is a challenge because we have to obviously trace from seed to sale. From our standpoint, the cannabinoids are coming in and they're all coming out equally in the finished good. So that should be sufficient that we showed we used X amount of cannabinoids into this production and a unit netted this amount of units that have this amount of potency. But honestly, at this point, Brian, I don't know exactly what that metric integration is going to look like when we implement it with our ERP solution because we haven't picked it out yet.
Well, the good news is Metric's fairly easy to integrate to. They have open APIs, and but again, you're also running into a situation where Metric surely is the leader in many states, but there's other states that don't use it. So depending on where you are, and some states have their own, so depending on where you are, you've got a sort of that integration issue could be certainly a challenge, and let them cover what they're covering on sort of the prohibitive, a THC angle. But even when you look at the product itself, even on the cannabis side itself, there's way more things that should be tracked and traced from that perspective. So that is I think that's a big challenge. You sort of hit on it, where that integration of those two are going to be sort of an issue, because you can't get away with not using those systems for what you're doing. It's absolutely critical to stay in compliance. So let's talk a little bit about really what you see as the future and how various regulations and shifts will impact this industry. What do you think needs to happen to advance it, and what do you think what's your sort of predictions?
Well, the obvious answer is federal legalization. It and having a path forward to sell these products, the products I focus on, which is low dose cannabis beverages alongside alcohol. Uh, I'm done predicting when the federal institutions are going to make their changes. Honestly, I thought it would have happened 2 years within me joining the industry 7 years ago. So at this point, I'm more focused on state level, specifically in California where I reside. But I think more and more states are going to start implementing their own hemp programs beyond what the Farm Bill calls for, because now that a lot of markets do have ingestible hemp products that contain THC in them.
Right.
And as you know, it's really confusing because the Farm Bill definition of hemp is 0.3% THC by volume, but that was not thinking of a finished good in edible or beverage form. So what's happening is these states, Colorado, New York, just recently tried to do it. Well, New York did do it, and they're up for discussion on what the new policy is going to be. Minnesota, California, to a degree, are setting up their own individual hemp programs. So not only is the cannabis industry fragmented on a state level, now the hemp industry is going to be as well. So unfortunately for brands, that's going to make it hard for you to be a national brand anytime soon because of all the challenges we were talking about earlier. But I do think at least more states are going to give a path forward for THC in a hemp format to be sold. And that's going to be really interesting if you're a state like California that has a developed cannabis program in addition to a hemp program as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems to be like the easy out for this, for federal production of a beverage, was just to keep it, 0.3% less THC, go the hemp side of the business. But to your point, that's going to be changing. So it's changing at a state level, and soon it's going to be changing at a federal level, right?
I hope so.
So yeah, I mean, it has to. It absolutely has to. So it's interesting because it's sort of you really have to understand the specific cannabis laws and regulations in your specific jurisdiction, and you really got to be an expert in it. So California inside and out, and You obviously know some other states as well. But if you're in a region where cannabis is legal, you should also be aware of the specific rules and regulations related to the production and consumption of these infused edibles and beverages. Because you made the point where you were saying, well, it's one thing, the legality of the product's one thing, but relative to the consumption side of it, it's kind of a different ball game. So you not only have to understand the plant, and the legalization of it there, but you also have to understand those nuances. So it's even more difficult to be, highly specialized, it sounds like.
Definitely, and it is hard to keep up with all that, especially if you're in multiple markets. And in the past, I think the appeal of being in multiple markets was to show top line revenue growth, expansion, and use that to raise more capital. But now capital is hard to acquire, and we don't. There's a lot of regulatory volatility all around. And initial investments into the space haven't netted out the way they were projected. So all that to say that as hard as it is, you're only making it harder for yourself if you spread yourself too far. So it just makes sense to pick what your target market is. Ideally, you live in that market, but you got to live and breathe every aspect of the regulations, production partners, distributors, retailers, you name it.
Absolutely. And, I consider you one of the go-to guys for cannabis beverages. And really, I mean it. It's the kind of people, you're the kind of person that helps to advance these industries, because you're not keeping it to yourself. You're willing to share, you're willing to advance, you're willing to, because you want to see the legitimacy of this industry. And as a pioneer and innovator, that's really important. So what would you recommend to those people in the cannabis beverage market, the emerging cannabis beverage market, to steal against volatility or safeguard growth? What would your recommendations be there?
I kind of been talking about it throughout this interview here. So I think a regional focus is the most prudent approach right now. Not only will you have a smaller region to focus on your product market fit, but you won't spread yourself too thin trying to get attention in too many places at once. And getting attention, even if you have a great product, does require some marketing effort, or you're playing a long game, just hoping word of mouth spreads it for you. In either scenario, you have to be mindful of your emotional state, your mental state, your energy levels. And this is a challenging industry. I'm hardened 7 years into it. But if you just try to go too big, too fast, and even worse, make decisions expecting regulations to change to support those decisions, that's just a short path to insanity. And I'm speaking from experience when I say something like that.
I agree with you there. Absolutely. It's really crazy. It's almost like we need a support group for, for
100%. And when I was a consultant, that's what I felt like, was a therapist most times, because I didn't have a brand of my own. So I'm just having all these founders come to me, feeling all their pain. So I'm trying to keep other people from feeling that same amount of pain.
Would you mind if we call you Dr. Paulo?
Well, I don't know. It just gets kind of heavy hearing all this world crashing around you and everyone's challenges, but it's what keeps me going is when I meet somebody who I give a cannabis beverage the first time to, and I don't sell them on it, and they just get excited and think it's the greatest thing ever. And then they follow up with a ton of texts asking me why they can't buy it in their hometown. So
Right.
I know everyone wants this. The market wants it. So we just got to you just got to persist and keep progressing every day. But also, like I said, protect your sanity, protect your emotional health, because it is going to be there one day, and you just have to persist and keep learning and influencing change whatever way you can every single day.
That's really great advice. And so I thank you for joining us. And we want to make sure that our listeners and our followers can find you. So what is the best way for folks to reach out to you?
Best way is I'm active on LinkedIn, where I know this is being broadcast, and then you can also email me my first name, Paulo, Paulo, at area1075.com.
That's awesome. Taylor, any last minute thoughts or things business we need to cover?
No, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, you guys.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, keep on going. Keep on, and we'll get that support group together.
Right on. I'll be here for it.
That's great. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.